It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey Not the Face with your host John Nash and your producer me, Steffi Haynes. And today is our year-end episode. This is the last show we're going to do for 2025, and it's going to be a look back on the biggest stories of the year. And we have this broken down into 4 parts. We're going to look at the UFC antitrust cases. We're going to look at the UFC's domination over the entire sport. And we are talking MMA here. We're going to talk about Saudi Arabia's attempted takeover of boxing and how successful they have been in that space. And hand in hand, their backing of TKO has allowed TKO to move very quickly. We're going to look at their attempts to basically change the entire face of the Ali Act with their new proposed bill, the Revival Act. So we're going to look at those 4 things, and we're going to try and break them down into basic parts and fit them into a show that won't take 22 hours. And we hope that you enjoy it, because this is the last show of 2025. When you hear us next, it'll be 2026. I can't believe how fast this year has flown. How about you, John?
Yeah, I was thinking today is like February 2nd, 2025, but now I realized the whole year went, and boy, there's so much I didn't get done.
Yeah, same here. You know, I had planned on losing, 25 pounds and fell shamefully short.
No, well,
there's a whole bunch of things I had planned to do in my house, and also fell shamefully short there too. But I did build myself a ramen cart, so I have all these different ramens and things that I can throw in them, and I have a refrigerator, a mini fridge with all these vegetables and all these different varieties of mushrooms and things like that I can put in my ramen. So I do feel accomplished in that capacity.
Well, I'm just getting ready for next year. My New Year's resolution is to quit heroin, so I got to start up heroin this weekend so I can quit it next year.
Well, maybe I will start smoking again. I haven't smoked in like 20 years. Maybe I'll start smoking the day before, just so that I can give it up, for my resolution.
That's my secret. I've learned, if you start something you normally don't do, it's pretty easy to quit that in the new year. So you have one successful thing for next year.
Exactly. So, all right. So let's go ahead and get rolling with this look back on 2025. And I'll tell you what, the highest point has been the UFC antitrust cases, but the rest of the year has been kind of dismal looking. Would you agree?
Dismal in what way?
Dismal in that the UFC has taken over all of MMA. Dismal in that Saudi Arabia has taken over boxing pretty much and choked out all the other promotions. Dismal in that most boxing promotions, almost all of them, don't have a broadcast rights deal in place. And dismal in the fact that this proposed changes to the Ali Act bill that TKO is doing is, it's looking like it might go through, and that's what I'm talking about being dismal.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I guess there's a couple ways we could weigh this. One is, first of all, everybody knows this show is business related, so we're talking about the business side. Now, if you're a sports fan, an MMA fan, these want to separate from the business, I actually do think this year was dismal on that front, because it did not feel like there was many big fights as usual. We didn't get the biggest fights that we'd hoped to get. We didn't get the most interesting, either in MMA or boxing. Boxing has migrated to spot TV show, DAZN, and other network platforms that make it very hard to follow and watch. Or they take place in Saudi Arabia, and there just doesn't seem to be much interest over there. At least, over here in the United States, over the shows in Saudi Arabia, there are times and stuff that are often not best suited for the United States. So yeah, on that front, just on the fan base side, I don't think it was that particularly strong year, good year. And then you look at the business side. Now, I guess if you're a shareholder in TKO, you think it was great. It went up like 50% over the year, so you've gained a lot of money. But if you are in the industry of MMA, I don't know if you look at it, or in boxing for that matter, I don't know if you look like it was a great year for you. And if you're someone that's concerned about one entity taking over combat sports, it was not a particularly good year. I guess if you're an ex-fighter and you finally got a check for the settlement, that was good for you. But yeah, on the overall, I think that the trend was, just as a fan of combat sports, it was not a particularly good year for the product that was produced. We didn't see the type of fights that generally get me very excited. We did see Canelo versus Crawford, but which is strange. That was not a fight really on my radar for one I was excited for. But when it showed up, it was an excellent fight. I'll give that fight a lot of credit. But that was like one of the few high points of the year. Jake Paul fights are not what float my boat, so I don't really care about those. So on that front, as a combat sports fan, this was a poor year for me. And for a fan of, hoping to see more competition in the market and maybe better treatment for the athletes, it does not seem like it was the trends were not trending in the right direction this year.
So you agreed with what I said, basically.
Yeah. Well, I just did, after you clarified, yes.
All right. So let's get started with our first of 4 topics, the UFC antitrust cases. I have 6 questions for you. So my first one is, what aspects of Lee versus Zuffa, that settlement, are the most important ones?
Well, first, we should note that the list here is basically as you commented earlier, is the biggest of things that happen. They're kind of umbrella terms we're using, so we can cover multiple things. But the biggest trends, the biggest happenings of the year that also will impact combat sports going forward. For Lee, the biggest parts of it. Want to repeat that question for me really quick to make sure I get it correct?
What part of the settlement do you think was most important?
Well, there's a couple. One part of the settlement that was important is that there was no injunctive relief. The second major part of the settlement, I think, is very important, is that the judge denied the settlement originally, and so they had to increase it to $375 million. And I would guess that's the most important aspect of the settlement, is that the fighters, it affects Lee only. That I guess if I had to sum it down, the most important aspect is the judge denied the original settlement. So now the settlement only impacts the Lee fighters, and that the amount of money they're getting is going only to Lee class, and they're getting $40 million more than the original settlement, so $375 million before expenses are split amongst the fighters, which is big because originally the original settlement included the Johnson class, so a percentage of that settlement would have gone to the Johnson fighters, and it would have been for $40 million less, so take it down even more. And there was that would have had some form of not injunctive relief, but remedy offered by the plaintiffs to the plaintiffs from the defendant, but it was really, really weak and didn't do much on the settlement. So now that the injunctive relief has been moved to the Johnson class, and that can continue. So the most important part of Lee, I think, is the fact that the judge made them go back, rework it, and got a better settlement for the fighters that affects Lee only.
Why was there no injunctive relief for Lee v. Zuffa? Why did it get moved?
Well, it's a long story, but and they never came right out and say it, but the most likely reason, if you read the way the case unfolded, if you read when the judge brought up what would happen with injunctive relief, is that the injunctive relief, because you need to have standing, and because a second lawsuit was filed because this case dragged on so long, because the Johnson v. Zuffa case got filed, you can't really ask for injunctive relief for older fighters that no longer are competing. The Johnson class handles current fighters. And so the judge said, if you want injunctive relief, we would have to open up discovery in Johnson. In other words, he was basically saying we would have to do evidence and more research, more regression models, more discovery, go through the whole Johnson case, and then we can make a determination if we went to trial, if there's going to be injunctive relief. And so the plaintiffs decided that, well, that means we basically, if we want injunctive relief, we've got to merge the Lee class with the Johnson and basically go through the whole process again through the Johnson case. And, they've already spent 10 years. They didn't want to do that. And so they agreed that the remedy portion, the injunctive relief portion, would be moved to the Johnson class. And that's why they lost it, because there's a second complaint and Johnson covered fighters that were currently active. They're the ones that would have the ability, the standing to have injunctive relief. And so the Lee class lost it. And because Lee class no longer had injunctive relief, it lost a major hammer, major cudgel it held if they went to trial over Zuffa. And so that also hurt the Lee class probably in the amount that they settled for.
Why did they settle for so much less than they were asking for originally?
Well, one, I guess, as we just noted, is they no longer had injunctive relief because the case had dragged out so long, because this Johnson class had to be introduced to cover future fighters. Otherwise, you're just forfeiting the damages for those fighters going forward, which would be, as an attorney, you really can't do. The Lee class lost the ability to ask for injunctive relief. So that's one. So they lost this cudgel that they held over the UFC. Now, the other part is, why didn't they go to trial then? Why did they settle for so much less than going to trial and taking a roll of the dice and going for the potentially billions of dollars they're asking for? And you see that in multiple cases. We just saw it the NASCAR. It went to trial, but they ended up settling still during the middle of the trial. Almost all these big class action antitrust cases, I say anti-class actions, but especially antitrust ones, because they treble the damages, they end up settling before you get to the trial phase. And the reason they settle is multifold, because one is, for the fighters, now them and their attorneys, they've spent, remember, 10 years out of their own pocket, the attorney's pocket. They're the ones spending the $1,000 an hour for the economic experts. They're the ones that are paying all these people to go through the documents. They're the ones that are not collecting fees as attorneys, working for free for 10 years, paying for hotel rooms and travel and all the stuff that goes with it. So they're spending tens of millions of dollars out of pocket and not making a penny on the work they're doing for 10 years. So they have that concern to worry about, even though they technically are not supposed to be concerned about that. They are, because that's just a massive amount of money you could potentially be losing out if you don't win the case. You got that part to worry about. Two, in these type of trials, with a jury trial, that jury has to be unanimous. You have to get every member of the jury, and I think this case there would have been 8 members of the jury, have to agree with you that the UFC violated antitrust law, all these different parts of it. And so you need 100% unanimous decision by the jury. If you get 7-1, even though it's a civil case, you think unanimity has to be only for like murder trials, criminal trials. No, for these type of civil cases, you still need all the jurors to agree with you. Otherwise, it's a hung jury. And so you're like, well, the odds are, and apparently, according to Zach Arnold, that they did mock jury trials. And during the mock jury trials, there was always or almost always one person that would hold out, that would agree with Zuffa. And so that's a tremendous risk to go into a jury trial and not win. Right. And so that was their other concern, I believe, is that they're like, sometimes you can't get all 8 jurors. So for the plaintiff side, they have to weigh that it's very difficult to win these cases. They do not have the cudgel anymore of injunctive relief to scare the UFC into settling for a higher amount. And they also have to be concerned about all the effort, energy, money, and they've spent for 10 years. Are they going to have anything to show for this when they're done? And I think that's why they settled for less. Now, for the opposite side, well, why didn't Zuffa go for a trial? And Zuffa has the same fear, the UFC, is that if it goes to trial and they end up losing, if the 8 jurors agree with the plaintiffs, then not only do they have to pay the amount of money, potentially pay the amount of money that the plaintiffs are asking for, the damages gets trebled. And so you have that to can be concerned about. So both sides goes back and forth. And so that's why these always end up settling. Now, I know a lot of people were disappointed with the settlement, the amount. And I think if they had injunctive relief, it would have been higher. I don't know how much higher, but when you look at people in the antitrust industry, in this industry, we saw there was articles written after the case. The plaintiffs were given like an A+ grade from people in the industry because they were very impressed with the size of the settlement and the nature of it. Now, we're people, in the industry, and we're well versed in the amount of damages the fighters were claiming, and and a lot of people were convinced, a lot of fans and people in the industry and fighters were convinced that yes, the UFC should have been paying us at least 50% or more of the revenue, so we should have got $1 billion plus in compensation for those damages. So this seems like a pittance, but for people that follow antitrust cases or that are attorneys that cover the legal aspects, for them, they were very impressed with the settlement. So you have this kind of dichotomy where us fans, people in the MMA industry, were just incredibly disappointed, almost outraged or angry about the settlement when it was first announced. And then people that are in the antitrust lawsuit business, they were like, wow, this was you guys are got to be doing high fives. This was amazing. And they were shocked when they found out that fans and fighters were just really upset about the amount that had been settled for.
Why did the attorneys get such a sizable amount? Now, I realize that you've explained part of that earlier, but go ahead and reiterate how much they did.
Well, because attorneys are leeches and vampires that take all the money, and there's partially that we have a system where we do let the legal system, the attorneys charge a lot, but for this case, you got to remember, yes, the attorneys got a third of the settlement, and that's a ton of money.
Just under a third. It was like 32%. Yes. It was like 32.1. Yeah.
Well, when you take you got to remember, first they got to deduct expenses. So, and those are to outside parties. So all the expenses that they had accrued, over $10 million, that was deducted at first. And then they got like 30%. So when you add the total amount that was taken away from the fighters to cover the expenses and the attorney fees, it ended up being about 1/3 exactly. Now, a lot of people are like, well, that's ridiculous that the attorneys got so much money. But, listen, I would think the fighters should have got more, and a third is close to 125 million. I think it was like 120 million total is 115 million. I think total attorney fees is just an insane amount of money. But at the same time, for all the fighters out there, the fighters were not raising the money to hire these guys. The attorneys were doing the whole suit themselves, right? They were paying for it themselves. They were taking all the risk. If they lost the case, they wouldn't have gotten a dime. They were carrying the entire risk. When people always say the promoter, this is the whole thing defense of the UFC often, or other promoters, is, the UFC, the promoter's taking all the risk. Well, in the case of the UFC, often they take very little risk per year because they have guaranteed contracts. But here, the attorneys representing the plaintiffs, they were taking tremendous risks. They were the ones that were spending the money on the experts. They were out millions of dollars out of their own pockets. Their firms had to pay for that. They were the ones that had worked 100,000 hours. I think they totaled billable hours that they had not been paid for, that they would not have been paid for if they lost. So all that was covered by the attorneys, and in exchange for the attorneys taking that tremendous risk and covering all the costs and doing the whole case, that for all that, that they get basically about 30% of the damages. And so I think, in the grand scheme of things, yes, that's a tremendous amount of money, and seems a tremendous amount of money, and I'd prefer that the fighters got more of it. But in the grand scheme of things, I'm like, that's kind of a fair trade-off for the fighters. You guys really, except for a handful of fighters that volunteered to be the named plaintiffs, the vast majority of fighters did absolutely nothing for this case, and that's a sad truth. The vast majority did not help, hand in evidence. In fact, we have an example now We got the current case going on where they do not have tweets or, messages, text messages from Dana White. I have not heard anything on this, but it's my understanding based on the hearings is that, has any fighter volunteered to send in the text messages between them and Dana White to confirm that Dana White is actually using his phone for negotiations? I haven't heard anything on that front at all. So that would be something that would assist the plaintiffs in the Johnson case. And my understanding, no fighter really did that in the Lee case. None of the managers did that. So yeah, these guys did it all themselves. And for all these fighters that basically took a free ride, they got something out of it. So, I can't see any real reason to really complain. Yes, I would like the fee to be lower, more money to go to the fighters, but at the same time, they literally did all the work for the fighters.
For 10 years. 10 years.
Yes.
All right. Why did it take so long for the plaintiffs to receive their payouts once this thing got settled?
Well, a couple things. One is we had that whole process. First, we needed the judge to approve it, and that took a while. And then we had the whole process of making sure they contacted as many fighters as possible. Many fighters had as chance as possible to sign up for it or to opt out. And then after they collected that, there's the whole period of time where they had to go through and adjust how much was going to be paid out based on the number of fighters. So there's all these steps that just add time. And then the final thing, after all that, then it probably took a few months longer than it should have, because it looks like Angion, the administration company, based on the conversations I've had with fighters and other people, they just kind of did a horseshit job, and they're getting sued right now by other people that they've worked with, administrated their cases for basically not stealing. They don't steal from the claims that they pay out, but they're taking back end payments from banks or whatever, where they could dump the money for a while. And so Angion, it does not sound like they did a very good job of distributing the money when they finally got the green light. So, the process was, I would say, after it was approved, because the court had a whole thing where they had to have an amount of time to contact all the fighters to make sure all the fighters were aware of it, to give fighters a chance to sign up, to confirm all their addresses and names and all that, because they, it's a large payment. They had to be 100% certain that the money they're sending is to the right person, because you're going to be hard to claw back that money. And they did not want third parties stepping in to steal that money from fighters. So they had to spend all that. So you're talking about, that's probably, 6 to 8 months of the time to go through all that. And then I would say add on another 2 months or 2 of just Angion apparently not being very efficient at distributing this money, that on some reason, they could not send it all out in one batch, and it looked like it was a multi-step batch based on fighter conversations. So instead of all out in 1 or 2 weeks, it took 6 weeks, 8 weeks to get out the vast majority. Now I think everybody's basically been paid except for a handful of fighters where there might have been, and in that case, it might have been fighters, the paperwork or the routing number or something kind of fell through the cracks, and they're trying to figure it out now. But my understanding, 99%, some, very large amount of the fighters have been paid now.
Final question on this. Moving forward, there are 3 new antitrust cases. Can you briefly tell us what is different about these 3 cases from the Lee versus Zuffa case?
Yeah. Well, the first we should know just about Lee is, we've spent years asking the fighters to do something. And for once, fighters did something. They actually stood up to the UFC, a small group of them, gone to the trial process, the court process, not trial, got a settlement, and got basically the largest lump payment fighters have ever seen in the sport. This year, with these payments, is going to dwarf any other year in fighter payment multiple times. Probably 3 times as much paid out to fighters this year than any other year, all because of the settlement. So this is the single largest pro fighter thing that's ever happened, right? Just a huge injection of money into the fighters we've seen. So that's one thing we should acknowledge. Now the other thing to acknowledge is that even though that case is settled, that's not the end of this effort. We have 3 additional potential class actions, antitrust complaints that have been filed against CFC. The first one is called Johnson v. Zuffa. That was filed back in 2021. And that is almost identical to the Lee case. All that is that it picks up in 2017. So Lee covered all the fighters and their fights from end of 2010 till July 1st, 2017. So everybody that fought in the UFC during that period was covered by the Lee v. Zuffa case. And the Johnson v. Zuffa, named after Cajun Johnson, picks up on July 1st, 2017, and is still ongoing. Every fighter that's fought in the UFC during that period is now in the Johnson case. And that's identical to the Lee, basically. It's the same complaint. They're asking for damages. They're asking for injunctive relief because the UFC, they claim, has exploited fighters by violating the Sherman Act, abusing their monopsony power to suppress wages. So that's that case. So very similar to Lee. And, we will see. It's in the early process. We're going to go to discovery. It will take several years if it falls. It will not take as long, I doubt, as the Lee case, because that had some just peculiarities about it. But we still are looking forward to a couple of years of discovery, a couple of years of expert reports and hearings, and then potentially maybe 4 to 5 years from now, class certification. And then we'll be, either it'll go to trial or likely if it passes, if the judge grants class certification, there's another settlement. So if you're a fighter in the UFC, you want to pay attention to that case. Because that could impact you just like the Lee case, and maybe that one has some form of injunctive relief, and maybe it even pays more in damages if you're lucky. So that's important because, again, people kind of did not think about the Lee case, and then suddenly they're getting a check when you had 5 UFC fights and you find out you have a check coming for $100,000. That's not a bad lump sum extra payment when your fighting career has long been over. And so hopefully the Johnson class fighters can get something like that. But in addition, the Johnson class has a wrinkle. In around 2021, the UFC introduced an arbitration agreement. And what that arbitration agreement was is that they put an addendum to all the contracts and said, if you want to fight in the UFC, you have to sign this agreement that says, I will not take the UFC to court. If I have a problem with my contract, I will go to arbitration. And if there's a class action, I will not participate in the class action. I cannot participate in the class action. I can only do my case individually, and I have to do it in arbitration. And so obviously the UFC has no monopsony power because they could not compel every fighter to sign this form, which every fighter did sign the form. So I guess that says they do have some form of monopsony power. So now every fighter that fights in the UFC now has signed this arbitration agreement class action waiver. And what that means is, well, the Johnson class covering all the fighters, it's suddenly missing a lot of fighters. A large number of the fighters that have fought since signing this new agreement cannot be part of this class action if the class is certified. And so they will be removed from this class action case, and they will lose out on any damages that could be won or on any money from any settlement. And then again, fighters, if you're a fighter currently in the UFC, this should be of great concern of you, because if you're hoping for a payout like the Lee class had, the only chance you have is if something happens to this arbitration agreement. And that gets us to complaint number 2. Complaint number 2 is Cirkunov, named after Misha Cirkunov v. Zuffa. And everybody should be thankful that Misha Cirkunov stepped forward, just like all the other fighters be thankful that Cajun Johnson, Tristan Connolly, and CB Dalloway stepped forward for the Johnson case, just like they all should be thankful for the original 6 litigants, because a handful of fighters are the only ones doing this for you guys. And Cirkunov's case is very similar to Johnson, but his complaint argues that his complaint is based on the fact that he has an arbitration agreement, and his complaint says that the arbitration agreement, the UFC violated antitrust law, Sherman Act, or I should be more clear, they violated Nevada law, which says you cannot have overwhelmingly basically monopsony power and compel people to sign unfair one-sided contracts. And so his complaint is arguing that that's what they did. And so he is trying to get those arbitration agreements and class action waivers thrown out so everybody in the UFC that signed them can be a participant in the Johnson case if it goes forward as a class action. So this has big repercussions, but potentially huge repercussions for the fighters, for the UFC. So it's an important case. And this is the one that Dana White is going to be called for to testify at a hearing, him and Tracy Long in February, about their missing cell phones, and which is the material that the judge wants to look at with regards to the Misha Cirkunov case. And this is also the case that the UFC's already filed an appeal to the Ninth Circuit, because apparently they have no interest. To me, it sounds like a Hail Mary, but it seems like they have no interest in having discovery for this case at all. I cannot imagine why. That it raises a lot of alarm bells go off when you're that adamant about not doing any discovery in this type of case. So that's the second case you pay attention. Now there's a third case, the Davis v. Zuffa. Phil Davis this time filed the third complaint against the UFC, asking for a class action case, wants class action certification. It's an antitrust case against the UFC, but it does not represent UFC fighters. In this case, he's representing fighters outside the UFC, and he's claiming that their actions have damaged the environment, the economy for all fighters, because it's basically withheld key assets to other promotions. They cannot compete and pay as much. And so he is not asking for money. He is just asking for injunctive relief. And in that case, he cites a lot of boxing history, a lot of boxing congressional records and legislative history, and precedent set in the International Boxing Club of New York case. And so that's the third case that's filed. And the issue with that one right now is, does Phil Davis have standing? And if the court decides he doesn't have standing, and by standing I mean, does he have the right to sue? Because he was a class member of the league class. And one of the things you had to do as the league class, when you got that money, you had to waive your right to sue for further antitrust violations, unless it was, the Johnson case, an already ongoing case, and they are claiming, the plaintiffs are, this really is not covered by the waiver that he did for the league class. And so the question of the court is does the waiver cover or not? And if the waiver does cover it, that means he doesn't have standing. So you're hopeful, if you want to see that case go forward, because that case is seeking the injunctive relief that everybody wanted to see for Lee earlier. They stated, I think it's a 1-year max to the contracts they are seeking. If you want to see that case progress, then either you hope that Davis has found that he has standing, can do it, or that hopefully that there's some other fighter that's willing, that has standing, that can step in to replace them. So those are the three cases right now, all of them riding on a very small handful of fighters that have taken the step forward to be the named plaintiffs for these cases. And they're all dependent on these handful of fighters.
That's going to take us into our next umbrella topic, which is the UFC's domination over the entire space. Now, first question here, and I just have three, but I realize that these three are kind of big questions, so be expansive. Why did the UFC land the most lucrative broadcast rights deal in the history of combat sports?
This is a good question, because there are questions about how they did that. You would argue that one reason they did it is because they have a very large loyal fan base, right? That they have a consistent fan base that is willing to follow them to other networks and pay a subscription fee to watch UFC events. And that's a reasonable explanation. There's a lot of truth to that. That's why other companies, that's why people bid for them. That's why people suspected that the bid for them would be approaching $1 billion, maybe not $1 billion. I think the most estimates were below $1 billion. In fact, almost every estimate was below $1 billion, but it would still been higher than their current deal. Their ESPN deal was paying for the pay-per-views and ESPN Plus on average about $500 million a year. I think it was the last estimate. And so, they thought the UFC can bring this fan base. And part of the argument too is it suggested in it is that because they have a monopoly, I should say, over the sport, because they can offer you the entire sport, all the fighters that people care about, all the matches that people care about, that that they can actually ask for a larger sum than other MMA promotions possibly could, because there are no competitors. It's either you get the UFC or you don't. And if you get the UFC, you get this entire MMA fandom with it. Okay, that probably explains a big portion of it. But then there's the question is, why was it so large? Because if you read a lot of the trades and, some of the complaints coming from, one of the reasons Warner Brothers says they do not want to take Paramount's offer to buy them is because they think Paramount has taken on too much debt. Paramount's taken on too much risk by signing deals with entities that were way above their market value, which seems a clear implication of the UFC, that they're implying that the UFC is well above their market value. And you can read other trades that people were kind of shocked by this number. So why did the UFC get well above what people thought they should have got? And, and if they should have got maybe the 800-900 million per year range on average, and now they're over 1.1 billion a year, how do they get this extra 10, 20, 30%? And you could, one thing could be that Paramount overpaid because Paramount wants to make a move into streaming, and they're going to pay the UFC as a loss leader to bring their fans and kind of kickstart the subscription. That's a possibility. But just as strong as it could possibly be the political connections here, because the Ellisons are trying to appeal to the Trump administration, because the Ellisons need the Trump administration to approve various mergers that they're doing, that the FCC and the FTC and the DOJ each have responsibility to oversee. And so the Trump administration could deny those on Ellison at any moment. And so you see with the Ellisons, one is they redid their CBS News broadcast, brought in Barry Weiss. They buried stories, paid off, CBS at the time, paid off the Trump administration on what a lot of people thought was just a frivolous lawsuit, maybe a buried recent story because they didn't want the Trump administration mad at them. So there's that front that they're appealing to the Trump administration, so they get approval on the various regulatory bodies approve these mergers. So in one way, they could also signal to the Trump administration is they got this buddy, Dana White, Ari Emanuel, the UFC on their broadcast. And that maybe explains a little bit. The other potential thing is that, based on reporting, is that the original merger between Skydance and Paramount took place at a UFC event, that it was negotiated there, that Dana White, Ari Emanuel are the ones that hooked up the Ellisons with the Trump administration to discuss that. So also suggests strongly that the political aspect of appealing, signaling that you're on the Trump administration side by getting the UFC might be part of it, but also might be some sort of quid pro quo, because the UFC might have played a part in getting FCC approval for that Skydance merger. So it seems, obviously the UFC was going to get a lot of money. I think we were predicting on here, maybe not $1 billion, but approaching, between 500 million and $1 billion, somewhere in the middle, 750, maybe a little higher. We thought it very likely they're going to have a big increase from their previous deal. But the reason that they blew past $1 billion very likely could be more political in nature, and more the links, the UFC, how they are they're the connection between the Trump administration and other entities, and that they are getting paid off because of the part they play in the Trump the Trump ecology over there. So all that comes together, and so I tend to lean, based on reporting, I tend to lean to the idea that there is that there was a premium paid for the UFC above and beyond the value it is as a combat sports product.
What's left for the rest of the promotions?
Not much. It's, for years now, we've seen people argue, the UFC doesn't have a monopoly. There's all this competition out there. And there's some truth to that. The UFC does not have a monopoly over MMA. There are multiple MMA promotions. There's LFA, there's Cage Warriors, there's PFL, but that's not the driver of the market. That's the part people miss, is they talk about, there's so much MMA fights, anybody can put on an MMA fight. And that's kind of a sleight of hand, because again, if you go back to the International Boxing Club of New York case, they found there's two different markets for boxing. There's boxing, professional boxing, and professional championship boxing. Professional championship boxing produced so much more revenue and interest from fans that it was a different market from regular boxing. And I think for the UFC, they are in the is the antitrust case, as the Lee case argues, and all the other cases argue, they produce elite level mixed martial arts, elite MMA. Well, just like the IBC of New York case, there's a difference that there's so much more interest and revenue generated by the elite level, which they have completely captured, except for, I guess you'd say Francis Ngannou and Chris Cyborg, but they're out there on their own floating around. That they own 90% of the top 10 fighters, basically 100% of the top 1 or 2, that they just the vast majority of the top 25 are in the UFC. Just the overwhelming number of the elite level, the people that really generate the revenue, they control. And so that leaves very little for everybody else. And if you notice, every time someone mounts a defense of the UFC, when the FTC investigated the UFC for this Strikeforce merger, the UFC sent a letter and said, oh, there's all these competitors out here we have to worry about. And then they gave a long list of competitors. And then you, lo and behold, 5-6 years later, you go back and almost all the competitors are out of business. Elite XC is out of business. At the time Strikeforce, they merged. Bellator is now out of business. And then you get to the Lee v. Zuffa case. And again, give a whole list of all these fighters, not fighters, but promotions that are serious competition for the UFC. And then you jump forward a few more years and you find out most of them are out of business, right? And now where we are currently, it's like there's, who do we really say is in competition with the UFC? I mean, you have Campbell McLaren out there arguing Combate is, but for God's sake, let's be honest. I mean, for God's sakes, no, they're not in competition with the UFC. They have a completely different product. We have PFL we had one, remember the duopoly? Mm. Well, where's the duopoly now? One barely holds MMA events. One barely holds events outside of Thailand. That one is, hundreds of millions of dollars have been lost, and that still shows no signs of making a profit. So one is, as we've long argued, one is not going to just disappear, suddenly implode. They're going to fade away, and that seems to be what they're happening. They're moving in the direction of fading away, being less relevant, and really having no impact on MMA. They are not a major MMA promotion at all. When's the last time you heard of a big signing to them? Go through the rankings, how many fighters are ranked on any of the independent rankings? Very few. They're just a non-entity. And then there's PFL, who's the new duopoly at the UFC. They can talk about as much as possible. But PFL, they're trying to get a TV deal. Their current deal pays about $10 million, from ESPN, and your $10 million versus $1 billion seems to be a pretty big difference. They are hoping to get a new deal, but it doesn't seem like they're very confident they'll get a big domestic deal, and not from ESPN or maybe not from anybody else. So there's not a large amount of interest in them like there is in the UFC. And a big part of it is you look at the number of top fighters they have. It's just a small as much as Don Davis makes this whole argument, we have just as the same quality as the UFC. Yes, UFC has 2/3 of the top 25 and you have 1/3. The part you're kind of not, you're ignoring is you have like 5% of the top 10 fighters and the UFC has 90% of them. And you have none, except for Francis when he fights, and he's only fought once in PFL, you have none of the top fighters, especially in the men's division. So the quality level is remarkably differently in PFL. It cannot compete with the UFC at all. And so is there, what is there for the other promotions? It's, it's what I've said, sometimes it sucks to be right. And it's something I've argued for a long time. And, a lot of people are like, oh, John, you're such a bandwagon guy for all these other promotions, but they seem to ignore the fact that I've always said, and I've told the promoters this when they've asked me, I've told other promotions this, if anybody that's contacted me, I told them, in the long run, you are doomed. And this seems to be confirmation of that. The end result that I kind of predicted is that in the end, you cannot compete with the UFC because the model they built guarantees that they will keep the top fighters, that you will not get the top fighters, and thus you will not get enough revenue to compete at all, and you will slowly wither away. And that's what happened to Bellator, and I told Bellator that would happen. That's what's happening to one, and we said that's going to happen to one, and I've told PFL the same thing, and I would not be shocked in the future if that's what, they're not going to like disappear overnight or anything like that. But the amount of attention we give them, the importance they have in the space does not matter nearly as much as it did when they first were spending all the money they got from investors.
So there's not scraps. There's literally just a few crumbs, basically. Right?
There's some money. Sorry, people, I was coughing out there. I think of my fans so much out there. I thank you guys so much. I mute when I'm hacking up a lung over here. There's a possibility there's some money to stay afloat. There's some, but you are not really competing in the space, right? And the only time someone's competing, the only time someone could have the money to put on an effort against UFC was when Showtime was paying Strikeforce. And so, sadly, Showtime started kicking themselves afterward that they let Zuffa buy up Strikeforce. And the other time was when DAZN was paying Bellator, that they had some sort of revenue. But there's, without that kind of backing, you can't compete with the UFC even at the bare minimum. And even then you can't compete because in the long run, the UFC's, they're going to grab the best fighters and the fighters you have are going to want to go there because all the top fighters are in the UFC and you cannot generate the revenue that the UFC can. So is it scraps?
It's crumbs.
Basically.
Crumbs.
Listen, and again, there are promotions that could potentially be successful. And I think like Ryzen, a lot of evidence suggests they do all right, but they're a little different. They're in their own little island, literal island of Japan. They have a market there to themselves. And that the UFC not going much into Poland and in Germany and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, it lets KSW and Octagon give some auction over there, and they can survive. But again, they're microscopic.
Gets some auction.
they get some auction over there, but we've seen their finances. They might be making money, but it's a small fraction, 2% of what the UFC is bringing in, basically, or less, maybe 1%. And so they're not really in competition. They're just left an area of the world where the UFC is not competing with them,
go ahead.
No, that's your best hope is you can find a niche somewhere where the UFC will leave you alone, and you can generate some money and pay some fighters. But the idea, so from a promoter's point of view, if you can find your niche, your little cubby hole in the world somewhere that you can build up and make the revenue survive, that's good. But for the fighters, I don't know what the benefit of that is, because what you want as a fighter is you want robust competition for your services. And there's not robust competition for your services because no one can compete with the UFC. No one wants to compete with the UFC. So what the promotions do is they focus instead on a way of getting you in the door into their walled garden for PFL or whatever, and then locking you in there, just like Bjorn Rebney did years ago. That's what they try to do. They want you in the promotion, then kind of trap you, because then they don't have to pay you nearly as much if they had to compete back and forth. And since no one can compete with the UFC anyway, because the UFC is getting all the revenue and the other promotions are going to end up losing money, you can't even get that bidding war going.
Now, last question on UFC's domination and the UFC umbrella proper. Moving forward, what can we expect given their super tight relationship with this political regime and the upcoming White House card?
Well, that's I'm not quite certain what we can expect. They've gotten a lot of benefit out of it already. One thing they got out of it is they do not have to worry about the Biden FTC.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Okay, the face!